So in terms of during the interview, what would be some advice you give for solving the design challenge?
Cool. So again, this question's slightly vague. I don't know if they're referring to a whiteboarding challenge or a take-home design challenge. So I'll briefly talk about both.
Mhm.
Um, Take-home design challenges suck. It's kind of a trap, and I think it should be abolished from the industry because your portfolio should be good enough. The only reason or the only time a design challenge is appropriate is if it's like an intern level role and then your applicants don't have a portfolio and you literally need it as signal of what they can actually do. If
Mhm.
you do have a portfolio and you're applying for like an intermediate role and above, um, what I usually say is, like I'm not comfortable like doing a take-home design challenge. Can we do a whiteboarding challenge instead? Or can you tell me what exact kind of signals or skill sets you're looking for? And I can pull up a relevant case study for you to look at in more detail. And that's like very okay to say. If they want to see how you can specifically solve for a problem within their very specific niche,
Mhm.
anytime they ask you to design something that could potentially be used in their product, you should always ask for compensation. It's the right thing to do, and you should not feel guilty about it. The running rate, even for intermediate designers, should be at least $100 per hour. And they'll be like, you know what, sure, like your portfolio is really good, you pass our whiteboarding challenge, but our product is extremely technical. Can you do a take-home design challenge on how you would design this new feature, add this new feature into your interface? Then you'd be like, sure, but you have to ask for money in that case. So don't feel bad about doing it. They're kind of a trap too because they always like, oh, like don't take more than 4 hours, but like there's always some keener spending like 2 weeks on it. So I
Mhm.
personally really, really hate the format, but that's how to navigate around it if you're presented with that option. So very rarely should you be doing take-home design challenges anymore. So I'm assuming the question is more on whiteboarding challenge. I
Yes.
think I saw a question from Gene. If they refuse to pay you, that company is probably not worth working for because they don't value design. Very, very harsh sentiment for me, so take it with a grain of salt. But I've basically turned down every single design challenge I've ever been asked to do that wasn't paid, and I haven't actually like lost a interview or lost an offer because of that. So be firm. They typically only do this for very, very junior roles as well. So once you get through that hump, you should never have to do a take-home design challenge again. So on the note of a whiteboarding challenge, a lot of people don't understand what it's for. So whiteboarding challenge isn't actually, it's to see your problem solving approach and what your process
Mhm.
actually is, because anyone can, create a wireframe after they've done the high-five mock-up and then just create some fake personas without doing their research in their portfolio. It's very common in industry. A whiteboarding challenge is to see your actual like methodical problem solving approach, and also to see how well you work within a team and how receptive you are to feedback. So oftentimes how a whiteboarding challenge is structured is we give you a very ambiguous and open-ended problem that is reflective of how you would get these problems in industry. And we intentionally do not give you enough information to solve it because we want to see what assumptions you'll make, what questions you'll ask, and how you kind of balance the two. So a lot of the times these questions will actually be abstract and non-digital. So a very common one that I love using is how would you design a alarm clock with only one button? And that alarm clock must be able to set an alarm, snooze, and stop alarm, and also view the time. So if I gave that to you, like, what would you do? Not a
Yeah,
rhetorical question. What would you
not
ask?
rhetorical. Yeah, no, I definitely ask of um, the user, well, not user, the target user group that they're looking at. So specifically of where they're collecting their data. So to find the most common feature used on an alarm clock, whether if it's a snooze button or
Well,
just like I ask specific questions of the age of the demographic they're focusing on,
Mhm.
of the users. Some users may just want, whether it's the elderly or teenagers who want to sleep in, that would dramatically determine the actual alarm clock. Also, what the physical features of the alarm clock are.
Okay.
Uh,
So
make into an Alexa. That's pretty funny.
So I think you're getting into like your approach, which is research first, identifying the target user and
Mm,
identifying the primary use cases, which is like a fair approach. But what
mm,
you should ask before that is actually you want to clarify the constraints and the scope of the problem. For example, a good question to be asked is like, what constitutes like an alarm clock within the context of this challenge, right? Can
mm,
it be voice controlled? Can it be digital? Can it be touchscreen? Um, what is a button? What constitutes a button? For example, like there's a lot of really interesting ones that have like dials with like multiple input modes. You want to
mm,
kind of define like the outer bounds of what you can design first. So basically drawing the box, define the constraints. That's step one. Um, so good questions would be like, is it analog or digital? Can there be a touchscreen? Can there be voice control? And
mhm,
what defines a button, right? Um, so you see how like I intentionally didn't give you enough information because I want to see you push the boundaries and what you
mhm,
consider in problem solving. Because when you go into like an actual company, they're never going to be like, here's all the information, solve the problem. Um, And yeah, I agree. It's very subjective. Every interviewer will have different answers for what those constraints are. The point is that you have to ask and verify those constraints. And we're also looking at what constraints you're paying attention to because that shows us how you think.
mhm,
So generally, like the approach, you can talk about like you should do, in the whiteboarding challenge, you should do more and talk less about like this is what I would do. Talk
mm,
about like what you're going to do and how you're doing and actually do it while you're in the session. So you
mhm,
can briefly talk about like you do a lot of research, but you can't demonstrate that within the session. So I wouldn't dwell too much on it, or maybe just save that for last. It's like, oh, if I had more time, or if this was a real project, then I would do demographic research, consumer research, etc.
mhm,
But generally, my model for this, take it with a grain of salt because you want to apply your own kind of approach. Is I start top down from high levels of abstraction to very granular levels of abstraction. So I start with the product thinking, and then the interaction design, and then the visual design. So what that translates into, like, I write out my assumptions first. Like, I would do user research, but we're in a session. So I'm assuming that the user is able-bodied, they're in North America, and they have access to like electricity, for example, and they live in a stable environment. I am also assuming that, actually, I don't know, you can list out your assumptions and then you can get into the actual design component, which is I start with information architecture, right? So I
mm,
list out all the outputs or the results, which is snooze, set alarm, view time. Um, I think those are the three. And then I talk about all the potential inputs. So what are the inputs? So even though there's only like one button,
mhm,
as you ask them like the constraints of the button, usually what I say is like, there's multiple input modes. You can do a long press, you can do a hold, you can do a double tap. All of those create different types of inputs, right? So I list out all the possible inputs, and then you can talk about use cases and red routes, and like what is the lowest interaction cost, what is the highest interaction cost of all the inputs, and then arrange it that way. You can also look into like errors, like what do you not want them to accidentally do when attempting to put in an input? Um, so that's like the interaction, information architecture piece. And then the visual part comes last is like, usually I'll let them do like a digital screen that's non-touch with very limited kind of like 8-bit rendering screen. Like how do you communicate different states and how do you map the states to the input? Because one of the things we also want to look for is like the system always has to give feedback to the user whenever they do an input and they have to show the
mhm,
result. So how would you actually communicate that? Like Do you have like a little blinking indicator when an alarm is set? Do you have an indicator for when it's snoozed? Do you have a countdown timer for when it's snoozed? So those are all questions that you need to think about. And
Hmm.
one thing to not stress about is like you don't actually need to finish the whiteboarding challenge. Some of the best interviews I've had just ended up being conversation, and the person didn't even draw anything on the whiteboard except for a few scribbles. That's perfectly fine. The goal isn't to come up with a polished solution. It's to see like, what is your approach to problem solving and like how methodical you are and what factors you consider.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Extremely helpful. Thank you, Richard. Just a good overview. So just quick question is, what do you use for whiteboarding challenges now that it's remote? I can actually answer this one if that's okay. I mean, there is Figma,
Yeah.
a lot of live demonstrations. I know like a lot of companies that kind of, they may ask you just kind of like quickly a dribble on, but Richard, with your experience interviewing people, what is more common
Um,
as a,
yeah. Not speaking on behalf of Facebook, but generally helping people prep for these whiteboarding challenges. Mural is really good. Mural,
mm,
Envision Freehand, and Figma are all very common. And worst case, like there's people that just like sketch on a piece of paper and then hold it up to the camera. That's fine too. Honestly, like for a whiteboarding challenge, we're barely looking at what you're drawing. It's really just about your problem thinking, and the whiteboard is literally a whiteboard for you to articulate and sort through your thoughts.
mm.